It's great to see all of you here. My name is Jen Reitz. I am with the University of Delaware, who's a proud part of the Mid-Atlantic TAB team. With me today, we have Lori Spagnolo, also from the University of Delaware, and then Catherine Gooding and Mark Buchanan, both with Marshall University, all parts of the TAB team. But we want to start out with just by saying, what is TAB? And TAB stands for Technical Assistance to Brownfields. And we, as this team, are responsible for the EPA Region 3, which includes Pennsylvania, Delaware, West Virginia, Maryland, DC, and West Virginia. Of course, can't forget. We are funded through the EPA, so our assistance is free. And we provide a wide variety of services, which I'll get into in just a second. But essentially to provide hands-on support for anyone looking to improve their communities through brownfield redevelopment. And so here's our Region 3 team members. And then just a little bit about our services. These are the 5 main categories that we do. Educational outreach, just like today's webinar is a big part of. We also do very individualized trainings within communities. We do 2 different types of grant assistance. One for those who are seeking grants and need to know what kind of EPA grant best suits their needs for their community. We'll assist with planning for that grant. We also review the grants before they're submitted. And then for those successful applicants, TAB provides a wide variety of support through the kickoff grant process, helping to find qualified environmental consultants and that type of thing. We also do site-specific technical assistance. We have 2 design studios on board with the team who will help with concept development planning, community engagement, and those types of on-the-ground work when you're really trying to visualize what the next steps for your brownfield are, as well as area-wide technical assistance. So bottom line is really, we have a menu of services, but our idea is really to meet you where you are and provide that individualized service for that fit your needs. So as Becca said, this is a 2-series interview we have today. We're going to focus on, there's a 5-step brownfield process. We're going to focus on the first 2 steps today, planning and assessment, as well as the introduction of climate, why include climate resilience and equity into brownfields. And then next week, which I hope you'll join us for, we'll be focusing on demolition, cleanup, and redevelopment parts of redevelopment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori. You're on mute.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everyone. Let's start with the basics, right? What is a brownfield? And according to the US EPA, a brownfield is defined as real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. So even if it's not technically contaminated or you don't know if it is, if there's a perception that it may be contaminated and it's hindering the reuse, that falls under the definition. Next slide, Jen. So this is what most people think of when they think of a brownfield, right? Maybe it's an abandoned industrial building or a gas station or a dry cleaner, but there are different types of brownfield sites as well. Next slide. So even a piece of vacant land could be a brownfield because there could be any number of contaminants there due to historical fill or dumping. And then shooting ranges are often contaminated with lead just because of the levels in the ammunition and the volume of ammunition that's used there. Next slide. So we want to get these areas cleaned up. But what we've learned is that it's not just important to clean up a brownfield, it's important to clean it up with the concepts of equity and resilience in mind. So what does that mean and why is it important? Well, there's a nuanced difference between equality and equity, and you can go ahead to that slide, Jen. It's a nuanced difference. And so equality means that everybody gets the same opportunities or circumstances, right? But it may not be appropriate for everyone. So what equity does is, equity is the idea of giving everyone the specialized kind of opportunities or circumstances that they need to achieve the same results and the same desired outcome as everybody else. So you can kind of see that represented in this graphic. And so why is that important in the brownfields space? Well, because historically, industrial areas were either located in or became areas with greater levels of poverty, and the type of industrial practices that were used had a disproportionate impact on the surrounding populations because of the industrial practices and also the use of coal-based power. So it's really important that we seek to actively correct these past harms and also prevent future risks. And so now when it comes to resilience, it's the same thing, right? So resilience is the idea that an area, whether it's through buildings or infrastructure, is resistant to the impacts of climate change, whether that is flooding or storm surge or extreme weather events. And that's important because on these waterways, right? So if you bump to that next slide, we just talked about the fact, like, the historical location of a lot of industrial places were along waterways because that's how goods and services were transported. And that's clearly where we're going to see some of the most severe and the first impacts of climate change, right, is along our waterways and in those different types of areas. So obviously, having industrial practices located near water pose significant environmental risks to the environment that was nearby, again, from those past industrial practices and from the use of coal-based power. So again, we're looking to not just clean up a brownfield, but correct past harms and also prevent future risks. Next slide. So the opportunity here is that with brownfields, it's an opportunity to remediate contamination, which is going to reduce existing health and environmental risks to address past harms. And then we also have the opportunity during the brownfield redevelopment process to transition to green practices and cleaner energy, which is also going to prevent future health and environmental risks, especially in the context of climate change. Next slide. So first of all, why is this important? Well, clearly it's the right thing to do ethically, right? But it will also make your application to EPA much more competitive. We all know these are key components of this administration's efforts to provide funding, and that is what agencies are going to be looking for. They're going to be looking for those components of equity and resilience in your grant applications. Next slide. So what we're going to kind of be taking you through is showing you how there is an opportunity at every single phase in the brownfield cleanup process to be thinking about equity and be thinking about resilience as you move through the whole redevelopment process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jen to talk a little bit about where we can incorporate these concepts during the planning phase of brownfield cleanups. There you go, Jen.
Actually, we're going to skip right to Catherine.
Oh, I'm sorry, that's right. And we did,
Right.
I apologize. We did want to ask, stop right there before the next section and ask if there were any questions. You can raise your hand or drop them in the chat, whatever you're comfortable with.
The chat is currently open right now, and I'm not seeing any raised hands yet.
Okay, well, I apologize. I'm going to turn it over to Catherine and let her talk about planning.
Thanks, Lori. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Catherine Gooding. I am with the West Virginia Brownfields Assistance Center at Marshall University. So we're located here in Huntington, West Virginia, but we work all across the state and especially the southern part of West Virginia. So today I want to talk a little bit about planning for resilient brownfield revitalization. This is, of course, where your process starts, thinking about, okay, we have a brownfield property, what do we want to do with it? And then also thinking sort of holistically across your city and across your community. What does planning for revitalization and reuse look like? So when we think about climate resilient development, there are sort of 4 key strategies we want to be looking at. And it's really about sort of understanding what you're working with, right? That's what this planning stage is dealing with, is what do we have in front of us? What are we dealing with? And figuring out where to go from there. So the first one is to identify and map climate infrastructure, and this could be anything like protected wetlands or green infrastructure. It could also look like community resilience hubs or things like that, ways that you already have protected the environment or are doing so in the community. The second strategy is to consider the impact of current and projected climate-related conditions. So these are things like sea level rise, floodplains, things like that. What are the conditions that your community and your property are going to be facing? And I think Jen is going to talk a little bit about some of the ways to identify what those conditions are. The third strategy is to screen properties for vulnerabilities to climate change impacts. So, when you're looking at a specific property, what is its particular needs? Is it more or less vulnerable in certain ways? What resiliency measures does it need related to those specific climate-related conditions? And also, what's its importance? What is the property? Is it a home, or does it have sort of a broader community focus? Is it a hospital or a school? Those sort of critical community infrastructure pieces may have particular vulnerabilities and need additional resiliency measures. And then finally, the fourth strategy we want to look at is engaging vulnerable and underserved populations to identify their needs for cleanup and reuse. And this can be through public meetings, it can be through advisory committees, any sort of thing like that. Ways to engage the community, and especially those who, as Lori was talking about, the way that brownfields have been cited historically has often been near underserved populations, and so they are more vulnerable generally to the environmental issues associated with brownfields. And so we're going to talk about each of these key strategies through a case study. So if we can go to the next slide. So Norfolk, Virginia is a really interesting case study, and they kind of show not only how important citywide planning is, but how incorporating climate resilience measures into local policy can build stronger communities that are better prepared to face the impact of climate change. And so they have, in 2018, Norfolk adopted a new green infrastructure plan, which is the map that you're looking at right now, and also a zoning ordinance. And the zoning ordinance is now considered the gold standard when it comes to climate resilience in community zoning. And I'm going to focus primarily on the zoning ordinance, but I do also want to highlight the green infrastructure plan because it does address each of these 4 strategies that we've talked about really in a clear way. So first of all, they mapped all their green infrastructure. You can see here this map that was created. They mapped their tree canopies, their protected wetlands, all of those sorts of things. They considered the sea level rise and used that to identify a time frame to complete shoreline restoration projects based on how the time frame of the sea level rise. They identified all their critical infrastructure here, their schools, public transit, even historical and cultural sites, and identified particular needs that those sites had. And they engaged with underserved communities in the city through 10 community meetings. They even identified African American heritage sites that they wanted specifically to protect. And so this was just a really great example of how a citywide green infrastructure plan has achieved each of those goals. But like I said, we're going to focus on primarily the zoning ordinance. And so if we can go to the next slide. The first piece of that ordinance was this concept of freeboard, which is, the height above the floodplain that new construction has to be. And so they said that if a new construction is within the 100-year floodplain, then it has to be elevated 3 feet above the base flood level of the 100-year floodplain. And if it's in the 500-year floodplain, it has to be 1.5 feet above that flood level. And that's just really valuable in terms of preventing flooding of properties. And even this graphic here is from FEMA, and it shows how it saves money over time, right, to be elevated above the floodplain. So that was the first element of that. And this is a great example of that second strategy, considering the impact of current and projected climate conditions, right? We know that this property is within the floodplain, so we're going to make it resilient by setting it up higher. Okay, next slide, please. So the next thing they had was this resilience quotient system, which I think is really interesting. And this says that in order to be approved, the plans for new construction have to earn a minimum number of points in each of the following areas. And those are risk reduction, stormwater management, and energy resilience. So there is a whole menu of options in each of these areas. And new constructions have to select from those options, and they get points allocated based on which ones they use. And so they have to have a certain number of points in each of those areas. So risk reduction can be anything like roofs or windows that are resistant to impact from hail or hurricanes or tree damage. These can be storm shutters, any sort of those things that protect the property or the building. It can be stormwater, or in stormwater management, this often looks like green infrastructure, so a green roof, a rain garden, pervious pavement, so things that increase sort of stormwater uptake. And also preservation of large trees on site, I thought was an interesting thing to include in stormwater management, that if there are large trees on the property, preserving those gets allocated some points. And then energy resilience, this can be using renewable energy sources like solar or wind. This can be microgrids or backup power plants, high energy or high efficiency heating and cooling, electric vehicle charging stations. So there's just all kinds of different options that developers can choose based on what the property needs. And the requirements for how many points they have to get vary based on the type and the size of constructions. So, multi-family apartment buildings are going to require more points than an individual single-family home. And this is a great example of that third strategy, using different approaches for different properties, understanding what the needs of the property are, and selecting from that whole menu of options based on the specific vulnerabilities of the property. Next slide, please. And then the final piece of this zoning ordinance were these overlay districts. And these are specific areas within the city that have been targeted based on their unique needs. And they have additional zoning requirements above and beyond what the baseline is. So there are all kinds of different overlay districts in Norfolk. There are historic overlays. There's one for the airport. But one that I find really particularly interesting is this coastal resilience overlay. And this is for properties right along the coast. Excuse me. And it requires all new parking spaces have to have permeable surfaces. There are required on-site stormwater infiltration and stormwater storage requirements. And they have to have salt-tolerant native plant species to be planted on these new developments. So this is, recognizing that sea level rise is likely to impact these properties, and making sure that there are ways to manage additional stormwater, and that the plants that are planted are able to tolerate storms and storm surges on these properties. And this is, again, a great example of all three of those first strategies, right? Mapping the resilience. So they went through and they said, these are the specific areas that need to be protected from specific issues. They identified specific climate threats like sea level rise and the specific vulnerabilities of each property, and included them in those zones based on those needs. So next slide, please. So I want to tie all this together in an example of a development in Norfolk. So they created this Water Street open space, which is sort of a public park, green space, gathering space in the city. It is part of a much larger Harbor Park waterfront redevelopment effort. The city, there had been a dilapidated building on this property. They demolished that building and they repurposed the concrete slab. You can kind of see on the left-hand side of the picture, I think the lighter concrete is that concrete slab from that building. And now that is a public plaza where they do farmers markets and outdoor events. They planted all these native plants and have bioretention methods on the property to manage stormwater. And all of this was funded through EPA area-wide planning funds. They had a Brownfields assessment grant. This Virginia Brownfields Restoration and Economic Redevelopment Assistance Fund Site Remediation Grant. That's a mouthful. So Virginia has funds, Brownfields funds that they contributed to this this effort as well. And so that brings me back to the point about when your grant, writing your grant, and why planning and zoning can contribute to a grant application for an EPA Brownfields grant. If you're able to show that you have these zoning ordinances or these citywide plans that implement climate resilience elements into them and show sort of a community-wide effort and a continuity of planning and development, that will really strengthen your application. And so showing that this is not just one green space, but it is part of a whole initiative, this Harbor Park waterfront redevelopment initiative. It is part of a strategically thought through climate resilience plan for the city. EPA is going to love to see that and will only strengthen your application. So that is sort of an overview. Obviously, not every community is going to be able to implement this level of zoning ordinance, but hopefully it gives you an idea of some elements that could be incorporated in your community. So with that, I will pass it over to Jen to talk about environmental site assessments.
I think we wanted to just pause a second and make sure there's no specific questions on Norfolk or the planning aspect before we move ahead. No?
Nothing in the chat right now, but feel free to keep any questions that you have, put those in the chat, or we'll let you raise your hand if it's easier to unmute yourself and ask.
Great. Okay. So with that, I'm going to move into the second phase of, or step in climate in brownfield redevelopment, which is the assessment phase, ESA, environmental site assessments. And key strategies are very similar to what Catherine had talked about, with some additional diving in, but really the assessment phase, I should back up. The assessment phase is really where we're looking for potential environmental concerns on a specific site. And where there is this potential is found, then you follow up with more specific testing and sampling to confirm what's there, where they are, and to what extent throughout the site different contaminants or pollutants are there. And it is a two-step process that we'll walk through. But there are several opportunities to build resilience and equity into this stage. And one of the opportunities is really before you even begin assessment, right? It's kind of that transition from planning. And say your community has several brownfields. They may be in a cluster, or they may be kind of spread out in different neighborhoods of your community. One of the way, when you want to do an assessment, how do you prioritize those sites? And one of the ideas is kind of look at what the climate impacts on the different sites could be. Are they located in a socially vulnerable community or a disadvantaged community? And take the opportunity to prioritize those sites as the first to be assessed. If you're not doing, there is the area-wide assessment that EPA provides for, where you can do more than one site at a time. But if you're not in that specific site, or you're a smaller community and aren't looking to do that, then you still want to prioritize the sites that you do have. And then we're going to, kind of drill down everything that we talked about at the planning level and at the community level, take that down to your specific site and look at how those conditions will change in terms of vulnerability, whether it's sea level rise, or maybe it's flash flooding. Is it a heat island? And maybe your site isn't directly in a disadvantaged community, but maybe it's adjacent to or just upstream, and so still has some negative impacts on communities that we want to provide special attention to as we move forward. And so I'm going to talk about the assessment, and then we're going to jump into a little bit about the tools. So let's go ahead to the next one. So phase 1 ESA, this is really the history of your site. It's where you're looking at researching deeds and past ownership of the property for any kind of hints that it might have been, even if it's not right now a dry cleaner or any of those uses that Lori highlighted. Maybe it was something in the past, and now it's a vacant site. And so the phase 1 is also known as an all appropriate inquiry, or AAI. Brownfields loves their acronyms. And so while you're in this kind of discovery phase about your site, this is a chance to kind of look a little closer for hints. Also look at those climate resilience things. The other thing I should note, not directly climate related, but this AAI, this phase 1 is something that everybody should keep in mind is one step that you want to make sure you do before acquiring any property, because this is where the phase 1 is what provides new owners liability protection, and also is something that is needed before you take ownership in order to be eligible for any of those EPA grants. So not specific to climate, but something that we always like to remind people of. But when you look at more specific to climate, you can look, and there's a site visit as part of your phase 1, is there evidence of past or ongoing flooding? Are there drainage issues, sign of water damage, or erosion on the site? And this may indicate opportunities to build in additional stormwater management techniques, some green infrastructure, or some other types of things that you want to note at this phase. You can also note the extent and the different types of vegetation on the site. Are there natives? Are there non-natives that might be more absorbent, more drought tolerant or salt tolerant, or whatever your local conditions are, making sure that that's noted as part of your phase 1. And so this, a couple of pictures here are showing a neighborhood in South Wilmington, which had some brownfields. It is a disadvantaged community, but also had some real low-lying areas that has, over the past 15-20 years, has really turned into a success story. They took the brownfield and looked at the different opportunities for remediation, and actually turned it into a wetlands park. So it became an asset for the community, as well as a major flood mitigation strategy. And so with that, moved on to phase 2 of the ESAs. And this is one where you're digging a little deeper. You have permission to be on the site and actually do testing and sampling, or I should say it's not you, it's your qualified environmental consultant who's doing the work, but they are looking at specifically doing the testing and looking at what pollutants and contaminants are located on the site. It can be an iterative process. It's something you need to go out and do and continually refine the testing and the locations. But what you're looking for in terms of climate is really like, what are those pollutants and how will they react to different conditions as the climate changes? How deep are they located if you are in an area that has sea level rise, or even land subsidence is an issue in parts of our region. Could those pollutants be impacted by high temperatures or high winds? Can they be mobilized with more intense stormwater, storm events? You can also, in this phase, it's kind of on the mitigation side of climate impact, but in phase 2, look at ways that the testing can be more environmentally and energy efficient, right? So maybe you can do testing on site versus sending tests out or transporting things out off of the site, which requires, intensive use of energy of vehicles. So there are ways of actually making the actual testing more energy efficient, and is something to look at. And so this actually, again, another Wilmington example, but this is on the northeast side. As you can see, it is located along the Brandywine Creek. And this is actually an area in September 2021 that Hurricane Ida breached the creek here in this area and created catastrophic flooding within this community. And so it has been an ongoing, there was an EPA area-wide planning grant that benefited the area in 2019. This was followed by an assessment grant that was completed last fall. And so this is some of the, some of that fine-tuned testing on the area. The vision of it is to be which we'll get, I have a slide in just a slide or two, is for it to actually become a living shoreline and to become a park, again, that will serve the community as part of the redevelopment plans. Next. Okay. So phase 3, which affectionately say ABCA, assessment of brownfield cleanup alternatives. The goal here is to ensure that cleanups remain effective as in the long term, right? That they remain viable as the climate changes, as condition changes in the area. And so we're going to do much more of a deep dive next week, teaser, into the different cleanup alternatives that are out there. And I hope you'll join us for that. But for today, we're just going to say that, again, you're just looking at what those alternatives are. Is it a cap that, again, if you're going to cap the site, is it going to be impacted by either land subsidence or sea level rise? Are there other, and if the remediation is more of a long term, is there an interim use or interim redevelopment plan that can help stabilize the site, both environmentally and for the community, in the short term or medium term? And so that's, again, going back to the site in the northeast, long-term plan, which the focus really of that previous slide was the riverfront itself here. There's a lot of redevelopment in the long-term plan, but in the short term, there are some things that we can do to stabilize it. They are actually in the process since Ida. They are actually, and this was done before that, they are actually in the process of completing a flooding study that will help to inform how high, this is a new street connection that's being planned along the new 12th Street connector. They're looking at what the height of that road should be so that it's not just a transportation amenity, but that it actually becomes part of the flood mitigation strategies as the community moves forward. Okay. So switching gears a little bit, and many of you it's hard to, like different levels of knowledge that we have on the call. So some of you may be very familiar with some of these, but, the tools that can be used to help inform this and in turn inform your grant applications, right? The EPA's own EJ screen, it shows a variety of, as you can see on the left, it takes a variety of environmental factors and maps them out visually. And they use percentiles so that it's kind of comparing an indices. So it's kind of comparing where a certain census tract or community falls with it when it's being compared to either the state that you're in or to the nation. And so this is a great one, kind of a first step. And then a very complementary tool that goes along with that is CGEST, as we call it. This is kind of the White House's version of the EJ screen. They do complement each other, and this is the map that shows how federal agencies will be guiding the benefits of certain programs, which I think Lori mentioned earlier, such as the Justice 40 initiative. And so again, it's ranking different types of burdens within your community and comparing them to other tracks at either the state or the national level. But it does have a very distinct, thing on the side. Is this a community identified as disadvantaged? Yes. And you have the outline, and so you can locate your brownfield site within that and use it, as part of your data points for your grant. Another one is the FEMA National Risk Index. This one takes a little different. It's all natural hazards with the exception of, I think flash flooding is not something that they have included, but it's looking at an expected annual loss. So it's kind of an economic assessment of what's happening, what could happen, or what the chance of loss. So again, going to that risk index, but it does have the social vulnerability aspect into it. One of the, just things to keep in mind for certain areas, because it relies on property values, some areas, naturally, their property values are much higher than maybe some of our rural communities. And so they may not show up quite as urgently or as high on the risk index as some other areas do. But another point of data point to consider as you're looking through. A lot of what is on the first two are really kind of existing conditions, especially when you're talking about flooding. It's kind of flood mapping is kind of a historic, a snapshot of historic flooding. NOAA has their sea level rise viewer, and so this is actually kind of projecting forward. This is referring back to, this is Newport News, so just north of Catherine's case study in Norfolk. And uses different colors to show the areas that could be inundated with sea level at 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot. And on this slide, you can actually see, so that you have actually a water level. You can pick which one you're looking at. Talking about sea level rise projections and reading about it in literature it can be a webinar all on its own and all of the thoughts that go into it. But in terms of just a snapshot and looking, you can see kind of, okay, at 1 foot, we're in the lighter blue or the darker blue. At 2 feet, we're in the, darker. And then at, 3 feet, we're getting into the green. And so you can, and it is very, resolution's very high. You can get down to, very site specific, to your site and really see what projected impacts could be at different levels. Just another one. So each state within our region has their own state resources. And so this is just, again, a listing of some of them. So when you have the slides, they're active hyperlinks. You can look into each of those as needed. And then even more, some things aren't really necessarily done at like the higher level, but maybe it's a city. Heat mapping, is something that's more and more commonly done. I found climatecentral.org. This was an interesting one I hadn't seen before, but in terms of the climate shift from this date, like a year ago, or and kind of has that comparison, and it's worldwide. But then locally, you might have an opportunity that says where your vulnerability is, and in compared to your urban heat indices. And kind of where we all things started with this resource, the Climate Smart Brownfields Manual that EPA put out, and has a lot of really fantastic resources at the end of it as well. So that is the end of my section. We'll go to Q&A, and then a reminder that we have next week is part 2, where we'll go through the next 3 steps and the actual redevelopment of the sites. So.
Great. Excuse me. Thank you, Jen. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. So, is potential subsidence from historical underground mining activities considered a resiliency factor?
That is an excellent question. I think Catherine has a better feel for.
I don't no, that's not me. I don't know who put that in. It's under my name. I don't know who.
Catherine.
I don't know who's in here under my name, but that's a really interesting question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Catherine. I didn't know.
Hey, George.
I would think it would be, Mark. Do you want to take that?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I suppose it depends, because I think when we talk about resilience, we're thinking about climate change, right? Specifically, like climate resilience is to do with climate change. I suppose if you think about subsidence in terms of like our increased frequency or you know, impact of storms impacting subsidence, more landslides and things like that, I guess you could see it from that angle. But just standard subsidence, I would say, is an environmental justice issue, but I don't know about a climate resilience issue. Do we have other thoughts about that?
Lori, did
Not
you?
to
wanna
get
go?
into groundwater flow and all that, but you've got your underground. In our region, obviously, it's coal mines.
Mhm.
Those are aquifers, actually.
Mm-hmm.
With increased storm events, you have more water, more erosion, etc. That came up a few weeks ago in a discussion with some people, and I said I have no idea. So I just thought I'd throw it out there for fun to see what everybody else thought.
I think you could make an argument for it for sure, especially with respect to storms and the increased size and frequency of storms for sure.
Beautiful. Were there any other thoughts from any of our other speakers?
I mean, I can't speak to whether that is something that strengthens your EPA grant, but I would think from just like Catherine said, like a general resilience standpoint, absolutely, right? Like if you're going to talk about strengthening the community for the future, then how can you not take that into consideration?
That's a fair point. Okay. Another question. You mentioned living shorelines. Can you just explain more like what that is and just tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, there are, at the water's edge, before people were around, that natural transition from the water to the land, that was a living shoreline. And so, in a lot of times when we're looking at cities, you either have a hard bulkhead, you have a hard kind of wall that lines that shore, or you can create this idea of a living shoreline, which essentially is taking space and land along that and that transition area and making sure that it's planted and constructed in a way that absorbs water and can help with flood mitigation, support wildlife and habitat along that way. And, essentially becomes for our part, I mean, what we're hoping for in Wilmington is, essentially it becomes a park that's usable for recreation, and is just creates a healthier environment along that edge.
Oh,
If anybody wants to add anything to that, please feel free.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a general, and this is another kind of focus of not just EPA, but the administration in general, is that consideration of natural spaces, which is kind of the green infrastructure approach, versus the hardening of spaces, which is really more gray infrastructure. And in some cases, you may not have as many options as others, but in addition to the concepts of equity and climate resilience, nature-based solutions, or NBS, or green infrastructure, or whatever you want to call it, is a real focus of a lot of the grants in that space today, because we're looking to move back to more natural transitions.
Thank you, Lori. All right, this next one, there's a couple of questions. I'm going to copy and paste this into the everybody chat because it's multi-parts, but can you provide some funding options to execute something similar to Virginia Beach as far as the green infrastructure condition mapping goes? And then is that an applicable action for EPA Brownfields funds and something that TAB can assist with, like is eligible? Oh, sorry, Norfolk. Not Virginia Beach, Norfolk. Norfolk.
I mean, I guess
I
I'll,
would,
oh, go
yeah,
ahead,
go
Lori.
ahead, Catherine.
No, I was just going to start by saying I'm not sure how Norfolk funded that, but I can certainly look into what their approach was. Lori, did you have thoughts about funding with EPA planning funds?
Well, I'm not sure. We'd have to confirm that it could be a potential use of part of the area-wide assessment. Not something we can certainly confirm. But I want to point out that there are different and complementary sources of funding that are able to complete activities like this. For example, FEMA works through their states to submit their building resilient infrastructure building resilient infrastructure communities grant through the states every year. And they have planning grants, which I would think would be a potential. So I think an activity like this would be a potential use for that. So in some cases, it may be a combination of, working through EPA's grant system and working through some other grants. But potentially it could be, I think, part of an area-wide assessment grant, although that's something that we would obviously run by our partners at EPA before, kind of moving down that path.
Hey, Lori, I could add to that as far as other sources.
Yeah, please do.
A lot of times in, green infrastructure, Clean Water Act funds sometimes come into play as well. That would come through the EPA. And then within each particular state, there's probably like a revolving fund of some sort where they'll have state dollars that go in to match the federal dollars. There's, like you were saying, there's probably a combination of some different pots of money at play here. But definitely on that Clean Water Act side, it wouldn't surprise me if that would be part of the Norfolk project as well.